Listen, a ranger in southern West Virginia heard her own voice, her exact voice, calling her name from below a closed ridgeline at 2:40 in the morning. She was standing at her truck with her radio in her hand and her mouth completely closed. She had been alone on that access road for 11 hours. The trail below that ridge had been shut for 6 weeks. Her thermos of cold coffee was still sitting on the hood of her truck, right where she'd left it. She put in for a district transfer the following week. She has not worked a night shift in these mountains since. What was below that ridge? How did it know her voice? But that story, her story, is the last one. Let's start earlier, quieter, with a trail register and a man named Dale Combs. 7 accounts, all from the Appalachians, all from people who carried a badge and a radio and still couldn't explain what they heard. The names have been changed. The locations have been adjusted. A few details were omitted at the request of the people involved. Everything else is exactly as it was reported. Dale Combs had worked the Monongahela district for 8 years by the time this happened, which means he was not the kind of man who spooked easily. 8 years of trail work in that part of West Virginia will either turn you into someone who understands the mountains or someone who quits in the first season. Dale was the kind who understood them. He knew which hollows flooded first after a hard rain, which stretches of service road went soft in spring, which trail markers needed replacing before they faded completely. He was methodical. He wrote things down. The assignment that morning was straightforward. A week of heavy rain had closed Laurel Branch Trail. Downed timber, 2 washed-out sections near the lower creek crossing. Conditions generally unsafe for public use. Dale's job was to walk the trail, assess the damage, flag what needed repair crews, and determine whether the closure could be lifted by the weekend. He'd done the same thing a dozen times. He filled his thermos at the district station before 6 in the morning and drove 22 miles of gravel service road to the Laurel Branch trailhead gate. The padlock was intact. He had the only key. He logged his departure in the radio register, signed the re-entry form on the gatepost clipboard, and started walking. The trail was muddy in the way that mountain trails get after sustained rain. Not slick exactly, but soft enough that his boots sank a half-inch with each step and left a clean impression. He noted 2 downed hemlocks in the first quarter mile, flagged them with orange tape, and wrote the location in his field book. The creek running alongside the lower trail was up, brown with runoff, loud enough that he kept his radio volume higher than usual just to hear dispatch if they called. They didn't call. Nobody was out there. It was a Tuesday morning in early June, overcast, smelling like wet bark and creek silt, and Dale Combs was alone on a closed trail doing exactly what the job required. The trail register box was at mile marker 1.4, bolted to a post near the junction where the lower trail connected to the ridge loop. It was a standard wooden box, weathered gray, hinged on top, the kind you see at every backcountry trailhead in the region. Dale opened it to check the last entry before the closure. Standard protocol, just to confirm the box was dry and the log was readable. The log was dry. The box had kept the water out, and the last entry was fresh. Not old-looking, not faded. The ink was clear and dark on a page that had not been rained on or humidity warped. The handwriting was neat, unhurried. It said, "R. Sutton, came through, everything fine." The date listed was 3 days ago, the day the trail had been officially closed, the day Dale himself had driven out and locked the gate. He stood there for a moment, reading it again. Then he took out his phone and photographed it, noted it in his field book as a possible pre-closure entry with an ambiguous date, and kept walking. The most reasonable explanation was a misdated entry. someone who'd come through just before the closure and written the wrong day out of habit, or someone whose watch was off. People did that. The box had kept the page dry, so the ink still looked fresh. That was all. He told himself that while he finished the damage assessment, the second washed-out section was at mile 2.1, worse than expected, probably a 2-day repair job. He flagged it, photographed it, wrote it down. The sky stayed gray. The creek stayed loud. Then, from somewhere on the ridgeline above him and to his left, he heard a whistle. 2 short, 1 long. He stopped walking. The creek masked most ambient sound, but the whistle had been clear enough to cut through it. High-pitched, human-made, coming from the steep wooded slope above the trail. 2 short, 1 long. The universal trail distress signal. He stood still and listened for 30 seconds. Nothing. He raised his voice and called out a standard ranger challenge. The creek answered him. The ridge didn't. He tried his radio. Static filled the receiver, then broke into a partial burst of white noise, then cleared into silence. Dead zone. He'd known it was a dead zone out here. That was one of the reasons solo patrols on Laurel Branch were supposed to be flagged with a dispatch in advance. He had flagged it. He marked the bearing and time in his field book, 9:47 a.m. northwest quadrant, above the 1.8 ridge contour, and continued toward the far end of the trail. 40 minutes later, the whistle came again. 2 short, 1 long, same direction, same ridge, same interval, or close enough to it, that Dale stopped walking and counted silently. 1, 2, 3, the way you do when you're trying to determine if something is repeating or if you're imagining a pattern. He wasn't imagining it. He called out again. Nothing. He could feel the ridge above him like a weight. The trees, too close together up there for any clear sightline. The slope, too wet and steep to climb safely without gear he didn't have. He decided it was an animal. Ravens could produce sounds close enough to a whistle to confuse a person, especially in a hollow where the acoustic properties were unpredictable. He'd heard stranger things from birds in this district. He marked the second bearing, same as the first within a few degrees, and pushed on to the Sycamore Fork end of the trail to complete the assessment. The Sycamore Fork gate was where the trail terminated on the opposite side, a second access point about 3 miles from the trailhead where Dale had started. He checked this gate the week before, when the closure was established. It had been padlocked. He had the same key that fit both locks. The Sycamore Fork gate was open. Not broken, not forced. The padlock was hanging on the chain, shackle up, open. As if someone had a key, used it, and didn't bother to resecure it on the way through. Dale stood at the gate for a long moment. He picked up the padlock and looked at it. No scratches around the keyhole, no damage to the shackle. He looked at the muddy track on the other side of the gate, the old access road that ran back into the closed section, and he saw boot prints. 1 set. Adult. Going in. The tread pressed deep and clean into the wet earth. No prints coming out. He looked at the gate. He looked at the lock in his hand. He looked at the trail of prints heading away from him into the closed section, into the hollow, toward the ridgeline where the whistle had been coming from all morning. The problem was not what he heard. It was where those prints were going, and the fact that there was only one key to that lock, and it was in his pocket. Dale stood at that gate for longer than he should have. He knew it. He kept turning the padlock over in his hand, checking the keyhole, checking the shackle, the way you do when you want the object to give you a different answer than the one it's already given. It didn't. The lock had been opened cleanly. No damage, no improvisation. Someone with a key had been through here. He radioed dispatch from the Sycamore Fork side, where the signal was marginally better, broken but usable. He reported the open gate and the register entry. Dispatch confirmed they were copying him, asked him to stand by, and went quiet. He stood at the gate and watched the boot prints while he waited. They went straight up the center of the old access road, spaced like a normal walking stride, and disappeared around the first bend about 60 meters in. The mud on either side of the prints was undisturbed. No scrambling, no sidestepping. Whoever made them had walked that road like they knew exactly where they were going. He didn't follow them, not yet. Instead, he marked the position in his field book, photographed the prints from 3 angles, and photographed the open padlock against the chain. Then he started walking the trail back toward the trailhead gate on the opposite end, flagging the prints at 20-meter intervals with orange tape as he went. He wasn't sure why. Protocol said to document and wait for backup. Something else, some quieter professional instinct, said to mark them before the afternoon clouds came in and it rained again and washed them to nothing. He'd reached the upper junction when he heard the whistle a third time. Except it wasn't from the ridge. It was from below him, from down near the creek. 2 short, 1 long. The same pattern, same pitch, same human quality he'd been attributing to a bird all morning. But now it was coming from the opposite direction. Not up from the ridge, not from the northwest slope where he'd been marking it. It was coming from downhill, from somewhere along the lower creek bank, in a direction he'd already walked and swept and cleared. Dale stopped on the trail and stood completely still. He let the creek noise fill in around him and waited. 1 minute, 2. The whistle didn't repeat. The ridge above was silent. The creek ran over its rocks the same as always, but the direction was wrong, and he knew it, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest like a stone. He walked out. Backup arrived 47 minutes after his second radio call. Ranger Keisha Marsh, driving up from the southern station, pulling her truck onto the gravel turnout at the Sycamore Fork gate. Dale had been waiting beside the open padlock. He handed her his field book without saying much and let her read the notes. Keisha was thorough. That was the first thing most people said about her, and they meant it as high praise. She read the notes, looked at the photographs on his phone, and then asked to walk the flagged boot print section before the lights started going. They went together, slow, one on each side of the prints to avoid contaminating them. The prints were still there, still one direction only, still ending at the bend. 200 meters past the gate, the prints stopped. Not at a landmark. Not at a rock outcropping or a patch of gravel where prints wouldn't show. They stopped in the middle of the road, in open mud, in a section where prints should have been perfectly legible in either direction. Dale had found this during his own documentation. He'd photographed the end point, just a final step, heel deep, toe pressing forward, and then nothing. No marks beside the road. No disturbance in the leaf litter on either shoulder. Nowhere for a person to have gone that wouldn't leave evidence in the soft ground. Keisha stood at the end of the print trail and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked if she could see the trail register entry. They walked back to the 1.4 junction box. Dale opened it. She read the entry. She was quiet long enough that Dale looked at her instead of the page. "What is it?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. She read it again. Then she took out her phone and compared something on the screen. A photo she'd pulled up from somewhere. A document image of some kind, small text. She looked at the phone. She looked at the register. She looked at the phone again. "There was a missing person case," she said finally. "On this trail, 2 seasons back, hiker named R. Sutton. He came out on an alternate route officially. Case was closed." She paused. "I was part of the initial search. I saw his paperwork." Dale waited. "The handwriting," she said. She said it carefully, like a person who has weighed a sentence before speaking it, and still isn't sure it should be spoken. I can't say for certain, I'm not a documents examiner, but the handwriting looks consistent with what I saw in his file. She said it that way, looks consistent, not matches, not as the same. She said it the way a careful person says something they've decided not to put in an official report. They logged everything. Keisha bagged the register page as a potential evidentiary document, photographed the print terminus from 4 angles, and called the closure extension into dispatch. The official report would note a gate malfunction, lock mechanism failure, cause undetermined, an ambiguous pre-closure register entry, and a series of boot prints attributed to an unauthorized person who had likely exited via the creek bank. The whistle would be logged as a probable animal vocalization. No further action recommended. Driving out just before the Laurel Branch trailhead gate came into view, Keisha said, "On my first season up here, an older ranger told me something about this trail." She kept her eyes on the gravel road. He said, "Don't whistle back at anything on Laurel Branch. If it whistles at you, walk out." Those were his exact words. Dale said he hadn't whistled back. Keisha nodded. She seemed genuinely relieved. They reached the gate. Dale got out and locked it, checked the padlock twice, which he hadn't done on any previous shift, and got back in the truck. He looked in the passenger mirror as they pulled onto the service road. The gate was correct. The chain was correct. 50 meters back, the trail register box was visible from the road, mounted on its post at the junction. Its door was open. He had closed it. He had specifically closed it after Keisha removed the register page. He had pressed the lid down until the latch caught and heard the click. They had both been standing there. Now the lid was up, facing the trail, open the way a waiting mouth is open. He told himself the latch was loose. He told himself the drive out had rattled it. He told himself a dozen things, the way a person does when they want very much to turn around and go home and not go back. He never went back to Laurel Branch. Not for the repair assessment, not for the post-closure inspection, not for any reason. He filed a request to have the trail reassigned to another ranger. The request was approved without comment. The register page is in a file somewhere. Keisha never formally documented the handwriting observation. As far as the official record is concerned, R. Sutton's case was closed 2 seasons ago, self-resolved, alternate route exit confirmed. What was never confirmed was what used his key, or what walked into that hollow and didn't walk back out, or what opened a latched box on a locked gate road while 2 rangers were still close enough to hear it. The next account came from a ranger stationed 60 miles south, working a solo winter patrol in a section of the National Forest where the elevation keeps the snow long past March. Marcus Webb was 29 years old, and in his 2nd year with the service when this happened, which matters because 2nd-year rangers are experienced enough to know what they're looking at, but still close enough to their training that they document everything. Marcus documented everything. That habit is the reason this account exists in the form it does. Precise, measured, with photographs and field notes that other rangers have since reviewed and declined to explain. His assignment that morning was a standard winter patrol on a section of National Forest Road in southwestern Virginia. Elevation running between 2,800 and 3,400 feet, depending on the stretch. The road was officially open but minimally maintained in winter, used primarily by rangers checking drainage infrastructure, and the occasional hunter with a permit. The temperature at departure was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was pale and flat. The snow on the ground was hard-packed from a freeze-thaw cycle earlier in the week. Not fresh powder, not soft, but a firm crust that held a clean impression if something pressed into it with enough weight. Marcus filled his thermos at a gas station 20 minutes from the trailhead, the kind of station that stocks hand warmers and ammunition and not much else, and drove the forest road in his service truck with the heater running loud and the radio on a country station that faded to static around mile 4. He switched the radio off. The road was quiet in the way that high-elevation roads get in deep winter. No traffic, no birdsong, just the sound of his tires on packed snow and the occasional tick of frozen branches in the wind above him. His first stop was milepost 9, where a drainage culvert under the road had frozen solid in December and needed a visual inspection before the next hard freeze. Standard work. He parked the truck in a wide spot on the shoulder, pulled on his insulated gloves, and walked to the culvert with his field book under his arm. The culvert was still frozen. He noted it, photographed it, and turned to walk back to the truck. That was when he saw the print. It was in the snow on the uphill side of the road, approximately 4 feet from the road's edge, in a section of a hard crust that had been completely smooth when he'd driven past it 30 seconds earlier. He would have seen a disturbance. He was a careful observer, and the snow was white and the road was empty, and he would have seen it. But there it was. A single footprint, right foot, human. Adult male, he estimated. The foot was large, the arch distinct, the toes pressed clear and separate into the crust. It was deep. Not the shallow scuff of a boot sole, but a full-weight impression, 4 inches down into snow that had resisted his own gloved hand when he'd pressed it during the culvert check. Whatever had made this print had pressed into that crust with considerable force. The print was barefoot, 18 degrees, hard-packed snow. A single barefoot right footprint with no approach track and no departure track, sitting alone on an otherwise unbroken snow surface. Marcus stood over it for a long moment before he did anything else. Then he took out his phone and photographed it from directly above, from each side, and from ground level. He found a measuring tape in his vest and documented the dimensions. He pressed his own gloved hand into the snow beside it. The crust gave slightly but did not yield a full impression. Whatever had made this print had been standing on it with real weight, real pressure, real presence. He searched a 50-meter radius on foot, moving in careful arcs, watching the snow surface. The crust was unbroken in every direction. No other prints, no disturbed areas, no sign that anything had approached this spot, stood on it, and departed. Just the single print, sitting in the middle of an otherwise perfect snowfield like something had been set down there and then removed. He radioed it in. Dispatch was pleasant and unhelpful in the way that dispatch tends to be when you report something that doesn't fit a standard category. The officer he reached suggested a boot lost in a fall. He said the print was barefoot, the snow was unbroken around it. There was no person and no boot. The officer suggested a practical joke. He said he was the only person on this road for at least 3 miles. The officer told him to note it in his patrol log and continue his route. He continued his route. The print faced uphill. He'd noticed that during documentation but hadn't said it on the radio because he wasn't sure what it meant, and he didn't want to sound like he was making the thing into something it wasn't. But it faced uphill, toward the slope above the road, toward a section of the forest the district called Reddish Knob Shoulder, a long, densely wooded ridge that ran for about 2 miles above the service road before flattening into a high bald. Marcus knew the area from maps. He'd never worked up there. 2 separate missing person searches in the district's recent history had been called off in that general area, both times with the subjects never recovered. He knew that from the files. Every ranger in the district knew it. He drove the rest of his route. He checked 3 more drainage points, noted a washout near milepost 14 that would need attention in spring, and turned around at the road's end to drive back out. He passed milepost 9 again. The print was still there, alone in the snow, unchanged. He stopped the truck. He sat for a moment with the engine running. Then he drove the milepost 9 access spur, a short side road that branched off the main forest road and ran about 400 meters to a small equipment turnaround, because it was part of his patrol and because he was thorough. At the turnaround, in the exact center of the gravel circle, there was a second print. Left foot, barefoot. The same depth, the same clean toe impression, the same full-weight pressure and crust that should have resisted it. Facing the same direction as the first, uphill, toward Reddish Knob Shoulder. 400 meters of unbroken snow between the two prints, with nothing connecting them. Marcus sat in his truck at the turnaround for a while. He photographed the second print. He did not get out immediately. He looked at the slope above the turnaround, at the dense tree line, at the place where the grade steepened and the hemlocks closed in and the light went gray and thin. Nothing moved. No sound reached him through the truck windows except the heater fan and the distant wind. He drove out without completing the on-foot inspection of the turnaround area. He noted this deviation in his field book and logged the reason as conditions and findings warranted early departure from standard protocol. He was not wrong to leave. At the district office the following morning, he showed the photographs to a seasonal maintenance employee named Roy, who had been working that particular section of forest, on and off, for close to 30 years. Roy was a practical man, not given to folklore or embellishment. He looked at the photographs without picking up Marcus's phone, holding his hands behind his back, reading the images the way a person reads a document they'd rather not have been handed. He looked at them for a while, then he straightened up and said, "Don't go back up there in winter, not by yourself." Marcus asked why. Roy didn't answer that. He walked to the coffee maker on the far counter and poured himself a cup, and didn't look at the photographs again. Marcus submitted the images with his patrol report. They were logged and filed. No follow-up action was ever recorded. His request that Milepost 9 winter patrols be conducted in pairs was approved within the week, without discussion, without anyone asking him to justify it further. Nobody asked him to explain the prints. Nobody offered him an explanation of their own. He's done winter patrol for 6 more years since that morning. He still works the district. He told the person who compiled this account that he has one habit now that he didn't have before. On the way out of any patrol route, he counts his own footprints in the snow where they're visible, just to confirm the number is right, just to confirm they're all facing the same direction. He said he doesn't know exactly why he does it. He just knows he started and he hasn't stopped. The third account involves a ranger who was not confused about what she saw. She was confused about what it wanted. Sylvia Cates had 12 years in the service by the time this happened, which meant she had seen most of what the backcountry produces. Injured hikers, disoriented hikers, hikers who had dramatically overestimated their own fitness, and a small number of the hikers who had gotten themselves into situations that required more than a water bottle and a trail map to resolve. She was good at reading people quickly. That was the skill her supervisor cited every time her performance review came around. She could assess a person in the field in about 30 seconds and know what she was dealing with. She could not assess the man she found at Cold Branch. The call came in around 2 in the afternoon. A day hiker couple reporting a person behaving strangely near the Cold Branch Wilderness boundary marker in eastern Tennessee. The couple had described it carefully, which Sylvia appreciated. The person was not injured, not calling for help, not in distress in any visible way. He was simply moving wrong. Those were the words they used, and they apologized for them, said they couldn't find better words. Moving wrong. walking near the wilderness boundary in a way that looked like circles, they said, though they couldn't be entirely sure from the distance they'd observed. Sylvia drove to the Cold Branch trailhead and checked the register before starting down the connector trail. No entries for today. The couple had already left. They'd given their contact information to dispatch and driven back toward town. She was alone on the trail. The Cold Branch connector ran about 1.25 miles before it reached the wilderness boundary marker, a carved wooden post at the edge of a long, irregular tree line that marked the transition from managed trail to backcountry land. The trail was dry, well-maintained, unremarkable. Sylvia walked it in just under 20 minutes, keeping her eyes on the tree line ahead. She found him about 30 meters off the trail, standing at the edge of the woods. His back was to her. He was not moving. He was standing in the narrow strip of open ground between the maintained trail corridor and the actual tree line, facing the trees, arms at his sides. He was wearing a green waterproof shell jacket, gray fleece visible at the collar, tan pants, brown trail boots. Standard hiking kit. Nothing obviously wrong with it. She called out the standard approach, identified herself, said she was a park ranger, asked if he needed assistance. He didn't turn. She moved closer, maybe 15 meters now, and called again, louder. He turned slowly. His face was calm. Not the blank calm of shock or heat exhaustion, not the relieved calm of someone who'd been waiting for help. Just ordinary calm, as if he'd simply decided to turn around. He looked at her without particular expression. She asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. She asked if he was lost. He said he knew where he was going. His voice was even, unhurried, slightly flat in the way that some people get when they're tired but don't want to admit it. She asked his name. He said something she couldn't quite catch. The wind picked up at exactly the wrong moment, pulling the syllables apart before they reached her. She asked if he was planning to enter the wilderness area. He said he was just walking. Then he turned back to face the trees. She watched him for a moment. He did not move toward the trees. He did not move at all. He simply stood there with his back to her again, looking into the woods, the same way she'd found him. She noted his clothing, his approximate age, mid-50s she thought, his build. She checked the connector trail in both directions. Empty. There was no vehicle at the trailhead she hadn't recognized. Then he started walking toward the tree line, and that was when she noticed it, the thing she couldn't name precisely in the moment and would spend a long time afterward trying to put into words. There was something wrong with the way he moved. Not a limp, not an injury. Just something slightly incorrect about the mechanics of it, the weight distribution, the timing between steps. She wrote it in her field notes later as movement appeared effortful, in a way inconsistent with terrain. The ground was flat, the grass was dry. He was walking on level earth and it looked like it cost him something to do it. She watched him reach the tree line and stop just at the edge of the shadow cast by the canopy. He stood there. She waited. He didn't go in. She completed her check of the connector trail area and walked back to her truck. She tried to remember the name he'd given. She couldn't retrieve it cleanly. One syllable, maybe two, something that started with a consonant. She wrote name unclear, wind interference in her notes. Then she went to her truck and pulled out the missing persons binder she kept in the passenger footwell, a laminated collection of active and recently closed cases in the district, updated monthly. She told herself she was being thorough. She told herself the clothing match was probably coincidence, and that she would confirm the coincidence and move on. She found the entry she was half looking for on the third page of the closed case section. Thomas Birch, 54 years old at time of disappearance. reported missing in October of 2019 after a solo day hike on the Cold Branch Connector Trail. This section. Never found. Case status: inactive. The clothing description in the file read, green waterproof shell jacket, a gray fleece, tan pants, brown trail boots. She read it twice. She looked at the photograph clipped to the top corner of the page. A man in his late 40s in the photo, heavier than the person she'd just spoken to, face fuller, hair shorter. She studied the photo for a long time. She could not say with certainty it was the same person. She could not say with certainty it wasn't. She closed the binder without marking the page. She sat in her truck for a few minutes. The trailhead was empty. The afternoon was quiet. Somewhere down the connector trail, if he was still there, Thomas Birch or whoever that man was would be standing at the edge of the shadow line looking into the trees. She drove back out to the service road and didn't turn around. That evening, she typed up her patrol notes. She logged the encounter as standard: person contacted, declined assistance, appeared oriented, departed independently. She did not flag the clothing description or the gait in the official report. She couldn't explain why not exactly. It just seemed like the kind of thing that required more certainty than she had before it went into any record that other people would read. In her personal field book, in the small green notebook she carried separate from her official log, she wrote both details: the clothing, the gait. And at the end of the entry, she wrote the file reference she'd found in the binder: TB 2019-014. She started the truck. She sat there. Then she opened the notebook again and added one more line. Go back. Pull the full file. The file reference was TB 2019-014. She wrote it the way a person writes something they already know they'll need later. She wrote it the way a person writes something they're afraid to actually look up. She closed the notebook and drove home. The district office kept its physical archive in a room behind the supply closet. Metal shelving, manila folders, the particular smell of paper that has been in the same place for a long time. Sylvia pulled file TB 2019-015 from the inactive drawer on a Thursday morning when the office was quiet, when her supervisor was out on a road inspection and the front desk volunteer was eating lunch in his truck. She wasn't hiding what she was doing. She just didn't want to explain it yet. She took the file to the small table in the back of the room and opened it. Thomas Birch, 54 years old at the time of his disappearance, which had been October 14, 2019. Retired schoolteacher from a town about 2 hours north, came to Cold Branch every autumn for a solo day hike, had been doing it for years. His wife had reported him overdue when he hadn't come home by 8 in the evening. Search and rescue had run a grid on the connector trail and the surrounding backcountry for 4 days. They found his car at the trailhead. They found nothing else. The case was closed 18 months later as inactive, the official language describing it as an unresolved disappearance with no evidence of foul play. The clothing description was on page 2 of the intake form, filled out by his wife from memory. Green waterproof shell jacket, Marmot brand she'd specified, gray fleece underneath, tan hiking pants, brown trail boots. She'd listed the boot brand too. She remembered it because she'd given them to him as a birthday gift 2 months before he disappeared. Sylvia read the clothing description 3 times. Then she turned to the photograph section at the back of the file. 3 photos. One was the same image she'd seen in the binder, the official missing persons photo, taken from a family picture, Thomas Birch a few years younger and heavier. The second was a photo from his most recent driver's license, clearer, more recent. The third was a candid shot his wife had submitted, taken on a hiking trail the previous summer. Thomas Birch standing on an open ridgeline with his hands on his hips, green jacket, gray fleece. Sylvia looked at the driver's license photo for a long time. Then she looked at the window. Then she looked at the photo again. She could not confirm it was the same person she'd encountered. The face she'd seen at Cold Branch had been thinner, the eyes sitting differently somehow, the expression carrying a quality she couldn't name. But she could not rule it out either. The build was consistent. The age was consistent. The clothing was not approximately similar. It was exact. She closed the file. That afternoon she called Ranger Dion Marsh, no relation to Keisha, different district, same service, and asked if he could meet her at Cold Branch the following morning. She told him she had a follow-up on a welfare check and wanted a second set of eyes. That was technically true. They met at the trailhead at 9. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of October weather that makes the mountains look manageable from a distance. Dion was experienced, steady, not prone to commentary. He read Sylvia's field notes on the drive-in without asking questions. When she finished explaining, he said, "All right, let's look." They walked the connector trail to the boundary marker, and then to the spot where Sylvia had observed the man the previous day. The footprints were still faintly visible in the dried leaf litter, shallow but present, a line of compressed leaves leading from the trail corridor toward the tree line. Dion could see them too. He crouched and examined them without touching the ground, then nodded. "These are real," he said. They followed the prints to where they ended, at the edge of the shadow cast by the canopy, the exact point where open ground gave way to the dimness under the trees. The prints stopped there. Not gradually, not with a final scuffed step suggesting a direction change. They simply ended. The last impression was a full foot, weight forward, as if the next step would have carried the person into the shade. There was no next step. Dion photographed the print line from several angles. Then he said he wanted to check the base of the tree line. The hemlocks were old and large at this section of the boundary, their root systems creating hollows and sheltered spots at ground level. He moved along the shadow edge, looking carefully. He stopped at the largest hemlock, maybe 8 meters from where the prints ended. "Sylvia." She walked over. At the base of the tree, tucked between 2 large surface roots, there were 3 objects. A folded emergency mylar blanket, silver, compact, the kind that fits in a vest pocket, folded into a neat square and placed flat on the ground between the roots. A trail bar still in its wrapper, the wrapper dry and uncreased, and a boot. Brown leather, well worn, right foot, trail boot. She did not need to check the file to know the brand. She'd read the intake form that morning. Dion photographed everything before they touched anything. Then he bagged the boot and the trail bar and the mylar blanket in evidence bags he carried in his vest, the same way any ranger carries them on welfare checks. He was thorough about it. He was quiet about it. "The trail was swept 3 weeks ago," Sylvia said. She said it partly to Dion and partly to herself. Seasonal maintenance. They would have noted any objects on the ground. Dion sealed the evidence bag. He didn't answer that. They walked back out to the trailhead. The morning was still clear. A few day hikers had arrived while they were in the connector section. An older couple with trekking poles. A woman with a dog on a leash. Ordinary Tuesday morning at a trailhead. The older man, standing near the register post, looked at their ranger vests and nodded the way people do when they're familiar with the service. Then he said, without being prompted, "You find someone up at the boundary again?" Sylvia looked at him. He was maybe 70, wearing a canvas jacket and good boots, the kind of person who'd been hiking these specific trails long enough to know the difference between a routine patrol and something else. "We're doing a follow-up inspection," she said. He nodded slowly. "There's a rule up here," he said. "Been a rule as long as I've been coming to this trail, and I've been coming 40 years. Don't follow them if they go past the shadow line." He said it the same way a person gives directions to a road: practical, unelaborated, learned from experience rather than read from a book. Some people come back to that boundary, they walk the edge. You see them sometimes, but you don't follow them past the shadow line. Sylvia asked who they were. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly. "I don't know," he said. "That's why you don't follow them." He and the woman he was with, his wife, Sylvia assumed, started down the connector trail without waiting for a response. The dog on the leash didn't look back. Dayon watched them go. Then he looked at Sylvia. She didn't have anything to say that seemed adequate. They loaded the evidence bags into Dion's truck and drove to the district office. The boot was logged as found property and attached to file TB 2019-014 with a notation. Item located at Cold Branch Wilderness Boundary, base of Hemlock. No prints indicating placement. Condition consistent with prolonged field exposure. That last part was not entirely accurate. The boot was well worn but not weather damaged in the way that a boot left outdoors for 4 years would be. Dayon wrote the notation. Sylvia signed it. Neither of them flagged the discrepancy. The file remains open in the inactive drawer. Sylvia knows because she checked 6 months ago. She didn't pull it out. She just confirmed it was still there, the folder still thick with its photographs and intake forms, and the boot inventory sheet Dion had typed up. She stops at the Cold Branch trailhead sign twice a week on the service road. She can see it from the truck window, the carved wooden post, the parking area, the connector trail heading into the trees. She hasn't parked there in 4 years. She thinks that's the right decision. She's never been entirely sure what the old man at the trailhead knew, or how long that rule had been kept, or who first worked it out. She only knows it was stated as fact, not warning, not superstition, not regional ghost story. As fact. The same way you'd tell someone not to cross a creek in the flood stage. The same way you'd say a road is washed out and there's no point trying it. Some people come back to the boundary. You don't follow them past the shadow line. The fourth account is the one that other rangers tend to go quiet around when it comes up. Not because they doubt it, because 3 of them were there. Kettle Ridge Fire Tower stood at 4,200 feet in the western edge of the North Carolina district, accessible by a 2.5-mile service road or a steep foot trail that nobody used in August because the grade was punishing and the humidity at that elevation in summer sat on your chest like a wet blanket. The tower itself was a standard forestry design, a 60-foot steel structure with a small cap at the top, big enough for 3 people if none of them needed to move around much. Equipped with a firefinder alidade bolted to a central table, a radio console, a propane lantern, and an old rotary telephone on the wall that had been disconnected from the line sometime in the early 2000s. The cab had 4 windows facing the cardinal directions and a wraparound catwalk outside the glass that nobody used at night. Pete Halloran had worked a fire watch at Kettle Ridge more times than he could accurately count. 52 years old, 19 years in the district, the kind of ranger who had stopped being impressed by elevation a long time ago. He knew the tower's sounds, the steel expanding in afternoon heat and contracting after sunset, the particular creak of the staircase in wind, the way the cab windows fogged on the inside when the temperature dropped fast. He knew all of it. Gabby Reese was 27, 2 years in the service, competent in the field and careful with documentation. This was her first fire watch overnight at any tower, which Pete had noted when the assignments came out and decided was fine. Overnight fire watch was not complicated. You watched the ridges, you logged conditions every hour, you called in anything that looked like smoke. That was the job. Amos Trent was 63 and had been volunteering as a fire observer at Kettle Ridge for 14 years, which meant he had been in that cab more nights than Pete and knew its sounds even better. He was not a ranger, he was a retired surveyor who had moved to the area in his late 40s and taken up fire, watching the way some people take up woodworking, because it suited him. He was quiet and observant and had never, in 14 years, reported anything he wasn't certain about. The three of them drove up the service road in Pete's truck at 4 in the afternoon, unloaded their gear at the base of the tower, and climbed to the cab. The dry period had been running for 11 days, no significant rainfall, fire danger rated high across the district, conditions requiring overnight observation at the ridge-level towers. Pete started the propane lantern and checked the radio console while Gabby spread the regional maps on the table beside the alidade, and Amos settled into the chair nearest the north window and looked out at the ridges. Everything was ordinary. That matters, because what happened later makes it easy to forget that for the first several hours, it was just 3 people doing a routine job at elevation. They logged the 6 o'clock conditions. They ate from the food they'd carried up, sandwiches, thermoses, a bag of trail mix that Gabi offered around and Pete declined. The sun went down behind the western ridge at around 8:30, and the temperature in the cab dropped about 15 degrees in 40 minutes, which was normal. Amos pointed out a small glow on a ridge to the southeast that turned out, after careful observation through the alidade, to be a campfire at a permitted backcountry site. Pete logged it as a non-event. The radio checked in with dispatch at 9 and at 10, and both times they reported conditions stable. The fog came in around 9, which was also normal for Kettle Ridge in August. It moved up from the valleys below, thick and white, and by 9:30 it had covered the base of the tower. By 10, it had reached the 20-foot mark on the steel structure. The cab sat above it in clear air, the lantern light reflecting off the top surface of the fog below them, and the effect was that the tower had become an island. The ridges were still visible above the fog level. The ground was not. Pete noted the fog in the log, and the 3 of them continued watching the ridge lines, which were what mattered. At 10:15, Amos said the ground-level storage room door was open. He'd seen it through the south window during a routine scan. The cab was 60 feet up, but the windows were large and the storage room was directly below. And in the lantern light that fell down the tower's exterior, Amos had seen the door sitting ajar. Pete was certain he'd checked it before they climbed up. He was a specific kind of certain, the kind that comes from habit. He always checked the storage room before an overnight because it contained equipment that shouldn't get weather damp. He climbed down the stairs. The fog was thick below the 20-foot mark and he moved through it with his flashlight, feeling the cold of it on his face. The storage room was at ground level, padlocked. He reached the bottom. The door was fully closed. The padlock was correctly seated in the hasp, shackled down, locked. He pressed the door with his palm. It didn't move. He climbed back up. Gabby said, "It opened again while you were standing next to it." Pete looked at her. She said it evenly, not dramatically. She said it the way she would have reported a smoke sighting, factually, with the understanding that she was reporting something she'd observed and not offering an interpretation of it. "I was watching it from the window," she said. "You were standing right beside it. It opened maybe 4 inches and then stopped." Amos had seen it too. From the north window, at an angle, he'd seen the door shift. Pete sat down at the console. He thought about pressure differentials, about the fog creating unusual airflow patterns around the base of the structure, about the padlock hasp possibly not being as secure as he'd thought. He had rational explanations. He selected one and stayed with it. They logged the 11 o'clock conditions. Wind calm, visibility limited by fog, no smoke observed on accessible ridgelines. The log entry was routine. Nobody wrote anything about the storage room door. At 11:40, the telephone rang. All three of them heard it. One ring, mechanical, clear. The particular metallic sound of an old rotary bell, nothing like a modern tone. It came from the telephone on the wall, the rotary model that had been on that wall since the 1970s, the one with the wire cut at the jack and the cord bundled with a rubber band and coiled on the table below the handset. The one that had not been connected to a telephone line for over 20 years. The ring lasted about 2 seconds, then silence. Pete crossed to the telephone. He stood in front of it for a moment looking at it. The handset was in its cradle. The wire was cut cleanly at the wall jack, the end of it exposed and inert. He picked up the handset anyway. Silence. He set it back. He wrote it in the log, 2340 HRs, anomalous sound from telephone unit, duration approx. 2 sec, cause undetermined. He wrote it in the same handwriting he used for wind speed and fire index readings. Gabby didn't write anything. She was looking at the telephone. Amos had been quiet since the ring. He was still in his chair at the north window, but he had turned away from the view and was looking at the telephone across the cab. He'd been looking at it for several minutes without speaking. The fog below the tower was total now. The tree line had been invisible for 2 hours. The ridge lines above were clear and dark against a partial cloud sky. In every direction that mattered for fire watching, the view was fine. In every direction below the 20-foot mark, there was nothing but white. The three of them sat with the silence that followed the ring and listened to the propane lantern hiss and the steel of the tower make its small noises in the cooling air. At 12:15, Amos spoke. He did not raise his voice. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, as a statement of observed fact. "There is someone at the base of the stairs," he said. "There is someone standing at the base of the stairs and they are looking up at us." Pete was at the railing before Amos finished the sentence. Not running. He didn't run in the cab. The space was too small, and the catwalk outside the glass was not something you stepped onto carelessly in fog, but moving, crossing the 4 steps to the south-facing window and looking down the staircase through the glass. The stairs descended in a straight line from the cab door to the fog line. He could see clearly for the first 15 steps, the steel grating, the handrail, the angle of descent. Below the 15th step, white. The fog had the tower's base completely, and there was no seeing through it from this angle, not even with the lantern light pushing down from above. He took the flashlight from the console and opened the cab door and leaned out over the railing, pointing the beam straight down. For a moment, and both Gabby and Amos would later describe this moment independently, without conferring first, the beam caught something at the base of the stairs. A shape in the fog. Pale, upright, approximately where the bottom step met the ground. It was there in the way that things are there in fog, which is to say it was not clearly defined, but it was not imagination either. It had dimension, it occupied space. Then the fog shifted in a way that fog shifts when something moves through it, or when the air pressure changes, and the shape was gone. Just fog. Pete called down. Standard challenge, clear voice. "This is a restricted area. Identify yourself." He said it twice. The fog absorbed the words. Nothing answered. He stood at the open cab door for a minute, the cold of the air coming up from the fog against his face, the flashlight beam doing nothing useful in that direction anymore. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. Gabby was at the radio console. She'd gotten a partial signal on the second attempt, broken, static heavy, but technically a connection. She was in the middle of a transmission when the signal dropped and didn't come back. She tried 4 more times over the next 20 minutes. Nothing. They were not in distress. That was the strange part to explain later. 3 experienced people in a locked cab 60 feet up with a clear view of every ridgeline that mattered, performing a job they were trained for, and none of them in any immediate danger they could name. The thing at the base of the stairs, if it was a thing at all, was not coming up. It had not moved, as far as they could determine. It was simply there, somewhere below the fog line, in a location that was theoretically inaccessible. The service road was gated. The foot trail required 2 hours of hiking in the dark, and the base of the tower itself was 100 feet of open ground from the nearest tree cover. Pete sat at the console and thought about that. The access. He thought about it methodically, the way he thought about logistics, and none of the numbers worked. Even if someone had driven the service road, the gate was locked, he had the key. They would have arrived at the base during daylight or early evening, and there would have been no reason not to make themselves known. Even if someone had hiked the foot trail in the dark, which was possible for a person who knew it well, the approach would have taken hours and would have been audible in the stillness that had settled over the ridge. He did not share this calculation with Gabby or Amos. It seemed more useful to keep logging conditions. At 2 in the morning, Gabby noticed the alidade. The firefinder alidade was the large metal mapping instrument bolted to the center table, a rotating sighting mechanism used to triangulate the bearing of a smoke source, precise enough to give a compass reading accurate to within a fraction of a degree. It was heavy, solidly constructed, mounted on a bearing plate that allowed rotation but resisted it. You needed to apply deliberate force to move it, and it held its position when you released it. The last time it had been used in any official capacity was 2017, according to the log. It had been sitting at the same bearing, more or less, since then. Gabby was certain of the bearing it had been at when they arrived. She'd noted it out of habit when she spread the maps, the way a precise person notices a compass heading without being asked to. She'd noted it, and she'd moved on, and she hadn't thought about it again until 2 in the morning when she looked at it, and the bearing was different. Not slightly different. Not the kind of drift you'd attribute to vibration or thermal expansion. It had rotated roughly 40 degrees from where it had been at 6 in the evening. It was now pointing northeast, toward the section of ridgeline directly above the closed foot trail access. None of them had touched it. Pete checked his hands as if looking for evidence he'd done it without thinking. He hadn't. Gabby hadn't. Amos, who had barely left his chair all night, hadn't. Pete wrote it in the log. He wrote the original bearing estimate, the current bearing, the time, and the notation cause undetermined. He wrote it in the same handwriting as everything else. They did not sleep. That was not unusual for a fire watch overnight. Sleeping was discouraged during high-danger periods, and the propane lantern and the radio checks and the regular log entries were designed partly to keep observers alert. But this was a different kind of wakefulness. Quieter. Each of them checking the windows at intervals that grew shorter as the night went on. Each of them listening to the tower's sounds and sorting them. Each of them aware of the other 2 doing the same thing and not mentioning it. The fog held until 4:30. Then it began thinning from the top down, the white surface dropping away from the cab and descending back toward the valley, and the base of the tower emerged into the gray pre-dawn light like something surfacing. Pete was at the south window when it cleared. The staircase was empty. The ground around the base was empty. The open ground between the tower and the tree line was undisturbed, as far as he could see in the early light. He looked for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "There's something at the base of the stairs." Not a person, not a shape. A circle of flattened grass, approximately 6 feet across, pressed into the wet ground at the exact base of the staircase where the bottom step met the earth. The grass was bent uniformly inward, the way grass flattens when something has been standing on it for a long time. The weight distributed evenly in a roughly circular pattern. No boot prints leading to it. No boot prints leading away from it. The dew on the surrounding grass was unbroken. They descended at first light, all three together, and Gabi photographed the circle from every angle before anyone stepped near it. It was real. The flattening was deep enough that the grass didn't spring back when she pressed it with her hand. It stayed down, compressed, the kind of impression that takes time to make. Driving out the service road an hour later, Pete slowed at the maintenance equipment shed near the road's junction with the county lane. An older man was there, unlocking the shed, work gloves already on, part of the trail crew that kept the foot trail passable. Pete rolled down the window. He described the night briefly, the shape in the fog, the alley dade, the grass circle. He was not someone who told stories like this easily, and he told it plainly, without editorial. The man listened without interrupting. When Pete finished, the man said, "You didn't go down, did you?" Pete said no. The man nodded. He said, "Don't go down when the fog covers the bottom. That's just the way it is up here. You don't go down to the base when the fog covers it." He said it the way you'd explain that you don't park on the soft shoulder after rain. A practical rule, derived from experience, not requiring further justification. Pete asked who had told him that. The man thought about it for a moment. "I don't know that anybody told me," he said. "I think I just always knew it. The way you know things about a place you've worked a long time." Amos retired at the end of that season. He didn't work another fire watch overnight at any tower, at Kettle Ridge or anywhere else. He didn't make a public explanation. Pete transferred to a district coordination role 2 years later, primarily administrative, minimal field work. Both of them are still with the service. The photograph of the grass circle is in Pete's personal files. He showed it once to a newer ranger who had heard the story secondhand and wanted to know if it was true. The newer ranger looked at the photograph for a while and then handed the phone back without asking any further questions. Nobody has asked Pete to explain the alley dade. He hasn't been able to. The fifth account has no witness. It has a piece of paper. Celia Marsh processed trail register logs at the end of each month, which was the kind of administrative task that sounds tedious until you understand what it involves. Every backcountry register in her eastern Kentucky district got collected, photographed, and cross-referenced against permit records and incident reports. It was careful work. Discrepancies, wrong dates, illegible entries, permits that didn't match sign-ins got flagged and investigated. Celia had been doing it for 6 years, and she was good at it, which means she noticed things that a less careful person would have filed away without reading. She noticed the Pinch Creek entry on a Wednesday afternoon in November, sitting at the small desk in the back of the district office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and a stack of October register logs sorted by trail designation. The Pinch Creek Trail Register had been collected on October 14th as a part of an evidence protocol. A missing person case had been opened on October 13th. A hiker named Daniel Farrow, 33 years old, who had signed in at the Pinch Creek trailhead that morning and hadn't come back to his car. Search and rescue had run a grid on the 14th, sealing the trail at 6 in the morning. The register had been pulled from the box at 5:45 in the afternoon by the search coordinator, checked for entries in the field, placed in a plastic evidence bag and sealed. Celia had the bag in her pile because closed search evidence logs were processed alongside monthly register collections in her district. The seal was intact when she opened it that afternoon. She noted the intact seal in her log before she opened it because she was thorough. She went through the register pages in order, the way she always did, working backward from the most recent entry to confirm dates and sequence. The entries for October 13th were normal. 3 separate sign-ins before Daniel Farrow's, all time-stamped in the morning hours, all with legible names and permit numbers she could cross-reference. Daniel Farrow had signed in at 8:47 in the morning. His handwriting was clear, his permit number correct, his listed destination the Upper Pinch Creek backcountry loop. Standard entry. The entry below his, which meant the entry made after his, chronologically, was dated October 14th. Time stamped 11:47 in the evening. The name in that entry was Daniel Farrow. Celia read it twice before she did anything else. The entry was brief. It said, "Daniel Farrow came through. Everything is fine here. You don't need to keep looking." She sat with that for a moment. She looked at the ceiling. She looked back at the page. The search team had pulled this register at 5:45 in the afternoon on October 14th. The entry was time-stamped 11:47 in the evening on October 14th. The bag had been sealed at collection. She was looking at the intact seal she had just broken herself, and had been in the evidence room since. The evidence room log showed no entries between collection and her processing 6 weeks later. She called the search coordinator, a man named Greg Tillett, who had been running missing person searches in the district for 11 years. She described what she'd found. He was quiet for long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then he said he'd come in. He arrived 20 minutes later and looked at the register page without touching it. He looked at the seal she'd set aside on the desk. He looked at the evidence room log she'd pulled. He went through the same sequence of logic she had already gone through, and arrived at the same absence of explanation. The official notation Greg wrote into the search file read, "Anomalous register entry discovered during post-incident processing. Entry dated 10/14, time-stamped 23:47 HRs, attributed to subject by name. Entry not present during the field review at time of collection. Seal integrity confirmed intact at processing. Cause undetermined. Entry forwarded to investigating deputy." The investigating deputy's explanation, delivered 3 days later in a brief phone call to Celia, described the entry as a probable clerical anomaly, a pre-existing entry that had been overlooked during the field review, possibly written earlier with an incorrect timestamp. He said the seal integrity was noted, but that evidence bags in field conditions could occasionally reseal if the adhesive was still active. Celia did not argue with this. She wrote it down. She knew enough about adhesive evidence bag seals to know that was not how they worked, but she wrote it down. There was one more thing. Greg had said it to her before he left the office that afternoon, standing at the door with his jacket already on, in the tone of a person reporting something they've decided is too informal for a written record. He said he'd looked at the handwriting. He said he had a sample of Daniel Farrow's handwriting from his permit application, which was in the file. He said he was not a documents examiner and that he was not making an official statement and that he could be wrong. He said the handwriting looked the same. Then he left. Celia wrote it in her personal log that evening. Not in the official processing record, not in the evidence file, in her own notebook, in her own words. The handwriting observation, the seal, the timestamp that was 6 hours after the register had been collected, the phrasing of the entry itself, which she had been turning over in her mind all afternoon and could not stop turning over. You don't need to keep looking. Present tense. Not "I'm fine" or "I made it out." Not a trail note written for the next hiker. A message addressed to someone specific. about something specific delivered through a sealed evidence bag 6 hours after the bag had been closed. Daniel Farrow had never been found. His car had been at the trailhead when search and rescue arrived on the morning of the 14th. His gear had not been located. His family had been notified that the case was open and inactive, which was the language used when a search had been suspended without resolution. The case was still open. Celia had checked 6 months ago, not by pulling the file, just by asking the system whether TB 2022-031 was active or closed. Active, the system said. She hadn't requested the physical file. She knew what was in it. She remembered which paperclip she'd used on the evidence page when she'd filed it. A standard silver clip, bent slightly at the lower arm, because she'd noticed the bend when she'd attached it, and thought she should use a different one, and then used it anyway. She hadn't gone back to check the handwriting against the permit application herself. She knew what she thought. She'd known since that Wednesday afternoon when the coffee was cold, and the register page was in front of her, and the sealed bag was sitting on the desk with its seal intact and broken, and she was trying to find a version of events in which the entry made ordinary sense. There wasn't one. She'd looked for it carefully, the way a careful person looks for an explanation, and it wasn't there. What was, there was a piece of paper in a sealed bag with a man's name on it, and a message written in his handwriting 6 hours after anyone could have written it, telling whoever found it that they didn't need to keep looking. She still works the district. She still processes the monthly register logs. She does it the same way she always has. Carefully, in order, cross-referencing dates and permits and incident reports. She reads every entry twice now before she moves on. She doesn't know exactly what she's looking for. She just knows she started doing it and hasn't stopped. The 6th account is the only one in this collection where a ranger broke protocol. He has never fully explained why, except to say that he heard something he recognized. Marcus Holt had 19 years in the service when the Penny Aldrich search began, which meant he had worked enough missing person cases to know the specific weight of them. The way the first 12 hours feel urgent and procedural. The way the second day starts to feel different, heavier. The urgency curdling into something that sits lower in the chest. He knew that weight, and he carried it professionally. He did not let it change his methodology. Methodology was the thing that found people. Penny Aldrich was 8 years old. She had wandered from a campsite on the Shavers Fork Trail in Western Virginia sometime between 9 and 10 in the evening on a Tuesday, while her parents were setting up a second tent for her older brother's friend who had joined the trip at the last minute. The parents had checked on her at 9. She was in her sleeping bag, and at 10 she was gone. No note, no signs of disturbance, no indication of anything other than a child who had unzipped a tent in the night and walked away from camp. It happened. Not often, but it happened. Children woke disoriented and walked toward sounds, toward light, toward nothing in particular. The first priority was always the creek. Shavers Fork ran about 200 meters from the campsite, and moving water attracted children the way it attracted everything else. They hadn't found her at the creek. Day 2 of the search had begun at 5 in the morning, with a briefing in the parking area at the Shavers Fork trailhead. 11 team members, 3 grid assignments, a dog unit that had been called in from the adjacent district and was expected to arrive by noon. Marcus was leading Grid C, the western slope above the creek, steep, heavily wooded, the kind of terrain where a search took twice as long as the map suggested, because every 10 meters of horizontal distance involved 6 meters of elevation change. Before the team dispersed, Marcus established the call phrase. Standard practice on child searches, a specific phrase that the child might respond to, known only to the team, used to distinguish a genuine response from ambient sound. He chose Penny, blue hat, because the intake interview with her father had mentioned that she'd been wearing a blue knit hat when she went to sleep, and a child hearing her own description called out in an unfamiliar voice sometimes responded where a name alone didn't reach. He walked Grid C for 6 hours, methodically, 5-meter intervals, calling every 30 seconds, logging every deviation from expected terrain. The slope was hard going. The leaf cover was thick, and the ground underneath was irregular, full of root systems and small limestone outcroppings that turned ankles if you weren't watching your feet. He was watching his feet and the grid and the undergrowth simultaneously, the way you learn to after enough of this work. At 2:40 in the afternoon, he heard something. It came from the northwest, upslope from his current position, and he almost didn't register it over his own movement through the leaves. He stopped. He stood still and listened. He heard it again. A child's voice, single word, something that sounded like "here." Faint, distant softened, the kind of sound that a hollow in the slope could distort into something that wasn't there at all. He marked the direction on his field map, radioed the report to the coordinator, and swept the area with 2 team members from the adjacent grid. They found nothing. 30 minutes of careful searching, nothing. He logged it as a possible auditory artifact, the mind finding patterns in ambient sound when searching for a child's voice was what the mind had been primed to do. He had seen it happen before. He had experienced it himself before. He marked the sector cleared and continued. At 3:15, from the same northwest direction, closer now, the voice came again. "Over here, blue hat." He stopped moving. He stood on the slope with his weight settled and his breathing controlled, and he listened to those 4 words fade into the trees above him. The call phrase. The exact call phrase he had established at 5 in the morning in the parking lot, in front of 11 people, none of whom were within radio range of this slope. Blue hat was not a phrase Penny could have known. It was not a phrase any hiker in this section of the national forest would have reason to use. It was specific, internal, operational. He radioed it immediately. He described the direction, the distance estimate, the exact phrasing. The coordinator told him to mark the position and hold. Backup would reach him in approximately 20 minutes. He acknowledged. He marked the position. Then he moved 30 meters toward the source. He knew he was breaking protocol. He made the decision consciously with full awareness that the coordinator had said hold, and he made it because 8 years old in day 2 and the creek hadn't had her, and the slope was the last significant terrain feature, and if she was up there and he waited 20 minutes. He made the calculation in about 4 seconds and he moved. The slope was steep here, the trees closer together, the light filtering down thin and green through the canopy. He moved carefully, watching his footing, keeping the northwest bearing in his head. 30 meters brought him to a section of the slope where the gradient eased slightly. A small natural bench in the hillside, maybe 3 meters wide, before the slope pitched up again. In the center of the bench, sitting upright on the compressed leaf litter, was a child's shoe. Blue sneaker, right foot, small size, consistent with an 8-year-old. Sitting upright, heel flat, toe pointing uphill. Not fallen, not dropped, placed. The kind of placement that required a deliberate hand. A deliberate decision to set it down in exactly that orientation. He crouched over it without touching it. He looked at the ground around it. The leaf litter was compressed in a rough circle, as if something had stood in this spot, but there were no clear prints. He looked uphill, through the trees, in the direction the shoe was pointing. He radioed the find. He described the placement, the condition, the location. The coordinator copied and said backup was now 15 minutes out. Marcus was still crouching over the shoe when the voice came again. Not from the northwest. Not from the same direction it had been coming from for the past 30 minutes. from directly above him, uphill, no more than 20 meters. Close enough that there was no ambiguity about what he was hearing. Over here, a pause. The slope was completely silent around the pause. No wind, no birds, nothing moving in the leaves. Then, "It's okay, Marcus." His first name. Not Ranger. Not Sir. His first name, spoken in a child's voice from 20 meters uphill, on a slope where no child had been found in 2 days of searching and where, as far as he could determine, no person should have been able to know what he was called. He did not move. He did not answer. He held his position on the bench with the shoe in front of him, and he did not make a sound. And he looked uphill into the trees where the voice had come from, and he saw nothing. The slope was still. The canopy moved slightly in a shift of air, and then was still again. He held his breath and waited. He counted 45 seconds in his head before he let himself breathe again. He counted them slowly, the way you count when you're trying to give yourself a task to perform instead of a decision to make. When he got to 45, he exhaled and stayed where he was and listened to the slope. Nothing. Not the voice, not movement in the leaves, not a single sound from the 20 meters of wooded hillside above the bench where he was crouched. The shoe was in front of him. He did not touch it. He radioed his position again and told the coordinator he was stationary at the find location. He did not mention that the voice had used his name. He noted this omission in his field book later and could not fully explain it, except to say that in the moment it seemed like information that would complicate things in ways that wouldn't help find Penny Aldrich. He told himself that. He mostly believed it. Backup reached him 14 minutes later. Rangers Andrea Feltz and Sam Kowalski, pushing up the slope from the south with their own radio noise arriving before they did. Marcus heard them coming and was glad of it in a way he didn't feel the need to examine closely. He showed them the shoe. Andrea bagged it without being asked, working efficiently, already noting the placement and orientation in her own log. Sam photographed the surrounding area. Neither of them said anything about the positioning, the deliberateness of it, the way it was sitting upright pointing uphill, but both of them looked at it for a moment longer than they needed to before moving on. Then Andrea said, without looking up from her log, "I heard something on my way up." Marcus waited. "A kid's voice," she said, saying words I couldn't make out clearly, coming from up the slope. She paused. "I thought I was imagining it." Sam said nothing. He kept photographing. The three of them went uphill together, 20 meters, in the direction Marcus had identified. The slope steepened again above the bench, the trees thinning slightly as the grade increased, the limestone outcroppings more frequent. They moved carefully and without rushing, and they found what was there to find. A small clearing, not a natural opening exactly, more a place where 3 large trees had died and fallen in the same direction years ago, creating a gap in the canopy and a relatively flat section of floor covered in old leaves and new moss. In the clearing, there was a shallow depression in the leaf cover, roughly the size and shape of a person lying down, or a person sitting, knees drawn up, the way a child might sit if they'd been told to stay in one place. The leaves were disturbed in that area and settled everywhere else. Beside the depression, centered between 2 of the fallen logs as if placed on a table, another shoe, blue sneaker, left foot, upright, toe pointing roughly north, in the same deliberate orientation as the first, and folded flat beneath it, creased into a neat square, a mylar emergency blanket, the same compact silver type, the same careful folding. No penny, no other disturbance, no prints in the moss that Marcus could identify with confidence, though the moss was thick enough that prints wouldn't hold cleanly. One shallow compression near the edge of the clearing that could have been a knee or a hand, pressed in and released. Andrea photographed everything twice before anyone moved anything. Sam marked the location on his GPS. Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the two folded creases on the mylar blanket. Precise, parallel, the kind of folding that took a moment of attention, and felt the specific quality of wrongness that comes not from something violent or loud, but from something careful. Something that had taken its time. The coordinator redirected the full team to their position within the hour. The dog unit had arrived by then and worked the clearing and the bench below it with the kind of focused intensity that meant the dog was on something real. Then it sat down in the center of the clearing and looked at the tree line to the north and did not move. The handler tried twice to redirect it. It sat. Penny Aldrich was found at 5:50 in the afternoon, 400 meters north of the clearing, sitting at the base of a large white oak at the edge of a small creek tributary. She was dehydrated and cold, and frightened in the specific way that children get frightened when they've been frightened for a long time and are suddenly safe. A kind of delayed collapse, tears arriving after the danger has passed. She was physically uninjured. The medical team checked her thoroughly. When her parents had her and the immediate crisis had resolved into the particular exhausted relief of that kind of ending, one of the family liaison officers sat with Penny for a few minutes and asked her gently what she remembered. She said she'd woken up in the night and walked because she heard something, and then she didn't know where she was, and she walked for a long time. She said eventually a tall person had shown her where to sit and told her people were coming. The liaison officer asked what the tall person looked like. Penny thought about it. She said, kind of like a person, but the words came after the mouth moved, like a movie when the sound is wrong. She did not know the call phrase. Nobody had told her. When the liaison officer mentioned Blue Hat in a follow-up question, asking if anyone had said those words to her, Penny said no. She had a blue hat, she said, but nobody had said anything about it. Marcus submitted his report that evening. He documented the shoe placement, the mylar blanket, Andrea's independent account of the voice on the slope, the dog's behavior at the clearing. He did not document the voice using his name. He wrote it in his personal field book the same night, in full, with the exact words, "It's okay, Marcus," and the direction and the distance and the time. He left it out of the official record. The phrase "blue hat" was noted in the search coordinator's summary as a possible auditory distortion event, ambient sound patterns misinterpreted by a searcher under stress, consistent with known psychological phenomena in extended field operations. This explanation was technically available, and Marcus did not contradict it. It did not explain how the voice had known the call phrase before it distorted. He did not note this discrepancy officially. That evening, after the debrief, a man named Dorsey Vance found Marcus in the parking lot. Dorsey was in his 60s, a trail volunteer who had been working mountain search and rescue in the area for 40 years. The kind of person whose presence on a search was considered useful in ways that didn't always fit a formal job description. He had a particular knowledge of the terrain that came from 4 decades of walking it. He pulled Marcus aside, not urgently, just with the quiet intention of a person who has something to say and wants to say it without an audience. He said, "Don't follow a voice that uses your name up here, on these slopes." He paused. "If it brings somebody home, you can live with that. But don't follow your own name on this terrain. That's a different kind of attention." Marcus asked what kind. Dorsey looked at him steadily. "The kind you don't want twice," he said. Then he went to his truck and drove out. Penny recovered fully. She started 3rd grade 6 weeks after the search. Her parents sent a card to the district office that said, "Thank you," and meant it. Marcus kept the card in his desk. He still works search and rescue. He is still good at it. His supervisor says so annually and means it. But he told the person who collected this account that he made one change after the Shaver's Fork search, a procedural adjustment that he has applied to every search since. When a voice calls his name in the field, he stops, marks the position, and waits for a second team member before he moves. He calls it good protocol. He tells newer rangers it's good protocol. He knows it's more than that. Penny came home. He has made his peace, mostly, with not knowing what was on the slope that day, or what it wanted, or what the words, coming after the mouth moving, meant to an 8-year-old sitting alone in the dark on a mountain. He focuses on what he knows. He knows the call phrase reached something that shouldn't have known it. He knows Andrea heard the voice too. He knows the shoes were placed, not dropped, and that the placing required care. And he knows that he didn't answer when his name was called. He stayed still, and he didn't answer, and 14 minutes later help arrived, and eventually they found her. He thinks the staying still was right. He thinks that most days. The last account is the one mentioned at the beginning. The ranger who heard her own voice from the ridge. This one takes longer to tell. You already know how it ends. Now, hear how it started. Dana Hollis had been a ranger for 10 years when she was assigned to Catawba Hollow, which meant she was experienced enough to know the difference between a place that felt wrong and a place that was simply unfamiliar. She had worked 3 districts before this one, and had spent enough nights on service roads and at gate junctions and on foot in backcountry terrain that the darkness didn't press on her the way it pressed on newer rangers. She was methodical, precise, not given to imagination. She carried a small green field notebook separate from her official log and filled both with the same careful handwriting. Capital letters formed consistently, lowercase letters consistent, every entry dated and timed. She wrote with a particular H, the left leg straight, the right leg straight, the crossbar centered. She had written it that way since grade school and had never had reason to think about it. Catawba Hollow was a north-facing hollow in the southern West Virginia district, closed for 6 weeks following erosion damage to the access road. 2 significant washouts in the first quarter mile past the chain gate, a third near the hollow's upper end where the road followed the creek bank too closely. The closure was administrative and temporary. Dana's assignment was night patrol of the access road and the fire road junction, checking the chain gate, walking the closure boundary, logging conditions, making sure nobody was accessing the closed section. She had done this kind of assignment before. It was not complicated work. The hollow had its own quality, though, and she noticed it on her first shift. North-facing hollows in this part of the West Virginia held cold longer than the surrounding terrain and collected fog in the evenings before the adjacent ridges did. The road followed a creek for a mile and 2/10 before it reached the gate junction, and the creek was loud enough in the upper section to mask ambient sound. Footsteps on gravel, distant voices, the particular sounds you relied on to know what was sharing a space with you. The cell service ended approximately 400 meters before the gate junction. The flashlight beam at that section of road reached maybe 60 meters before the hollow's walls absorbed it. She filled her thermos before each shift at a gas station 18 miles away, the same station every time. Bad coffee, the kind that tasted burned by 10 in the morning and was fine by 10 at night when your standards had adjusted. She parked at the gate junction, set the thermos on the hood, logged her arrival, and walked the boundary. Every shift, the same sequence. On her third shift, at 11:05 in the evening, she heard a whistle. 2 short blasts, 1 long, coming from the ridgeline above the hollow to the northwest, somewhere up the steep wooded slope that rose from the road's edge to the hollow's rim. She marked it, direction, time, estimated distance, and shone her flashlight up the slope. The beam reached the first tier of hemlocks and stopped at the dark above them. Nothing visible. She called out the standard challenge. The creek answered her. The ridge was quiet. She attributed it to an animal. Certain raptors produced sounds in the right conditions that passed for whistles at distance. She had heard it before in other districts. She marked it in her field book and continued her patrol. She tried her radio from the gate junction, which was where reception was marginally better than anywhere else on the hollow road. She got intermittent copy, enough to log a routine check-in, and moved on. The night was cold for the season, the fog starting to build in the lower hollow around 11:30, the creek running fast with recent rain. She completed the boundary walk, confirmed the gate chain was intact, and sat in her truck for the last portion of the shift, logging conditions. At 11:20, she wrote an entry in her field book. She did not remember writing it. The next entry she remembered writing was at 11:42, noting that the boundary was clear and conditions were stable. 22 minutes between the two entries, and she had no account of them. She had not slept, she was certain of that, with the particular certainty of someone who knows the feeling of dozing and knows she hadn't. She had simply lost 22 minutes somewhere on the hollow road with her thermos on the hood and the creek running in the dark. She noticed this the following day when she typed her log, transferring the field book entries into the digital record. She typed the 11:20 entry and paused. She looked at the handwriting in the field book. She looked at it the way you look at something that seems slightly off before you can identify what's wrong with it. The entry was in her handwriting. The letter spacing was hers. The pressure on the page was hers. The line breaks were hers. But the capital H in the entry, she'd written hollow and highway in that block, was formed differently. The left leg had a slight curve at the base. She did not form her H that way. She had never formed her H that way. She stared at it for a long time. She held the notebook up to the window and looked at it in better light. The curve was there. Small, consistent across both capital H's in the entry, as if whoever had written it had a slightly different habit and had otherwise replicated her handwriting well enough to pass. She typed the entry into the digital log exactly as written. She did not flag it. She set the notebook on her desk and picked it up twice more before she went home, reading the entry again each time, and each time arriving at the same absence of explanation. She told herself the cold had stiffened her hand. She told herself fatigue changed fine motor habits in ways a person didn't always notice. She told herself a dozen ordinary things. Then she drove back to Catawba Hollow for Shift 4, because the road needed patrolling, and she was the ranger assigned to patrol it. And whatever had happened to her handwriting on Shift 3 was not a sufficient reason to request a reassignment. Not yet. Not over something she couldn't describe in official language without sounding like someone who had lost 22 minutes on a hollow road and was looking for a way to make that someone else's problem. She drove back. She parked at the gate junction. She put the thermos on the hood. She checked the notebook before she got out of the truck. Her H straight legs, centered crossbar. Hers. She got out and started the boundary walk. And somewhere above her on the ridge that she couldn't see in the dark, the hollow waited in the way that some places wait. Not threatening, not welcoming, just present in a way that made the road feel slightly narrower than it had been the shift before. The whistle came on Shift 4 at 11:40, which was 35 minutes later than it had come on Shift 3. Same ridge bearing, same pattern, 2 short, 1 long, and the same quality to it, the same human precision that she had been attributing to a bird and was finding harder to attribute to a bird the second time she heard it from the same compass point. She marked it in her field book. Time, bearing, estimated distance. She did not shine her flashlight up the slope this time. She stood beside her truck at the gate junction and listened for the repite, and when it didn't come, she got back in the truck and sat with the engine running. She had made one change since shift 3. She had added a motion sensor to the driver's side exterior. A personal device, not standard equipment, the kind used by hunters and trail camera enthusiasts, battery-powered, clipped to the door mirror housing. It triggered on heat and movement within a 15-foot radius. She had not told dispatch she'd added it. She'd told herself it was a practical precaution on a solo night patrol of an isolated road, which was true, and she'd told herself it had nothing to do with the lost 22 minutes, which was less true. At 12:15, the sensor triggered. The alert was a small vibration on her phone, which she had in her hand because she'd been looking at the map. She looked up immediately. The road ahead was empty in the headlight reach. She rolled down the passenger window and listened. Creak noise, wind moving through the upper hemlocks, nothing else. She took the flashlight and swept the road's edge on both sides. The gravel showed nothing she could identify as a fresh disturbance. The ground beyond the gravel on the hollow side was soft from recent rain, and she looked at it carefully, in sections, working the flashlight beam in overlapping arcs. Nothing that she could name. A compression in the leaf litter near the road's edge, maybe. That could have been a boot and could have been a deer, or could have been the way the leaves had settled after the rain. She noted it in her field book with appropriate uncertainty and continued the shift. Shift 4 ended without further incident. She checked her handwriting before she closed the notebook. Her H correct. She drove to the junction of the hollow road and the county lane on her way out, and slowed at the small house set back behind a rusted gate on the uphill side of the road. The only occupied structure within 3 miles of the gate junction. A house she'd noticed on her first shift and registered as the kind of detail worth knowing. Lights on in the front room. An older woman on the porch despite the hour, sitting in a wooden chair with a blanket across her lap, looking at nothing in particular. Dana stopped the truck. She rolled down the window and identified herself and asked if the woman had noticed anyone accessing the hollow road during the closure period. The woman looked at her for a moment. She was in her 70s, Dana guessed, with the particular settled quality of a person who had lived in one place long enough to know it the way other people know their own house. She didn't seem surprised to see a ranger at her gate at midnight. Her name was Ruth. Her family had owned the land at the junction for 3 generations. She said, "Don't write in that logbook when you can't remember writing. And don't answer anything that calls your name up on that road after midnight." She paused. "If it sounds like you, that's the worst one. Just drive out." Dana felt the cold of the window on her arm. She asked how Ruth knew about the logbook. Ruth said, "Because my daddy was the ranger here before the road got its current name. He had the same problem. He didn't drive out." Dana asked what had happened to him. Ruth said, "He's fine. He's 94. He won't talk about it." She adjusted the blanket across her lap. "He stopped going up there, that's all. He just stopped." Dana sat with that for a moment. The engine idled. The hollow road disappeared into darkness behind her. She thanked Ruth and drove on. Shifts 5 and 6 were quiet. She logged everything and double-checked her handwriting after each entry, holding the notebook under the truck's interior light before she closed it. All correct, her H straight-legged and unambiguous. She began to think that the Shift 3 entry had been an anomaly she would not be able to explain, and would need to learn to carry without resolution, the way experienced rangers occasionally carried things they couldn't file and couldn't discard. Then Shift 7 came. She arrived at the gate junction at 10:50. Cold night, no fog yet. The creek lower than it had been and quieter for it. The chain was intact. She logged arrival, made the thermos, walked the boundary. The ridge above was dark and still. No whistle. She completed the boundary walk by midnight and sat in the truck and logged the quiet conditions and felt something close to relief. The specific relief of a night that is passing without incident. She was writing the 209 entry when she lost 31 minutes. She became aware of herself at 2:40. Not waking, she was standing outside the truck, both feet on the gravel road, facing the ridgeline above the hollow. The truck was behind her with the door open, the interior light on, the engine running. Her flashlight was in her hand but switched off. The night was around her and the ridge was above her, and she had no account of the last 31 minutes. Not a fragment, not a transition, nothing. One moment she was writing in the truck and the next she was standing in the cold, dark, facing uphill with a dead flashlight in her hand. She got back in the truck immediately. She closed the door and locked it. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her breathing deliberate and measured. Then she picked up the field book. The 209 entry was unfinished. She could see where her pen had stopped mid-sentence, the last word trailing off slightly. Below it, in the gap between that entry and where she'd begun writing again, there was a new entry. Time-stamped 209. Complete. In handwriting that was almost hers, that replicated her letter spacing and her line pressure and her notation style, except for the capital H in Hollow and Hollis, her own name, written in her own book, which had the curved left leg, the wrong H. Twice, in the same entry, unmistakable. The entry read, "Everything is fine on Catawba Hollow Road." She is still here. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She looked at the ridge through the windshield and the ridge was dark and gave nothing back. She started the truck and sat for another minute, the heater coming on, the cab warming around her. Then she called her colleague, the one she'd asked to do the 2 a.m. radio check, the one she'd told it was a signal test. She told him she was leaving the shift early and would explain in the morning. He said okay, and she heard the slight concern in his voice and was glad of it, glad that someone knew she was on the road. She opened the field book one more time before she put it in drive. Below the wrong H entry, below "She is still here," there was a second entry. Time-stamped 2:40. This one was in her handwriting. Her H. Her pen pressure, her spacing. She had written it herself. It read, "Resumed patrol. All clear." She had no memory of writing that either. She had no memory of anything between 2:09 and 2:40. And somewhere in that gap she had written "all clear" in her own hand, and something else had written above it in an H that wasn't hers, and she was sitting in a truck on a hollow road at 2:40 in the morning, reading both of them. She put the truck in reverse. She drove backward down the Catawba Hollow access road in the dark, watching the rearview camera instead of turning around, the headlights pointing back toward the ridge she was retreating from. She did not turn the truck around until she reached the county lane. She did not drive forward toward the gate again. 400 meters from the gate junction, where the cell service returned, she called her colleague again and told him she was out. He said good. He didn't ask why she was reversing down a hollow road at 2:40 in the morning. He seemed to understand that the explanation could wait until daylight. She sat at the county lane junction for a moment before she drove home. The hollow road disappeared behind her into the dark. Above it, somewhere on the ridge, something had known her name well enough to write it in a book she kept in a locked truck. And it had called itself She. Dana arrived for shift 8 with one change to her routine that she hadn't told dispatch about. She'd called her colleague, his name was Ray, 12 years in the service, steady and undemanding, and asked him to radio check her at 2 in the morning. She told him it was a signal reliability test for the Hollow Road dead zone, which needed documentation for the district's infrastructure report. Ray said sure and didn't ask follow-up questions, which was one of the things she valued about him. She had not requested a transfer. She had thought about it in the 2 days between Shift 7 and Shift 8 with the particular quality of thought that goes in circles. Reasons to leave, reasons to stay. The professional cost of requesting a reassignment she couldn't explain in official language. The personal cost of going back. She was assigned to this patrol through the end of the closure period. The erosion repair was on schedule. 3 more shifts, maybe 4, and the road would reopen and the assignment would end on its own. She decided to finish it. She arrived at the gate junction at 10:50. Cold and clear, no fog, the creek at its normal autumn level. She logged arrival, poured coffee, walked the boundary. The chain was intact. The ridge above was dark and still. She completed the boundary walk in 40 minutes and returned to the truck and wrote the 11:30 entry and checked her H before she closed the book. Straight legs, hers. She sat with the engine running and the radio on low and waited. The whistle came at 12:50. 2 short, 1 long. Same ridge bearing it had always been. Northwest quadrant above the hollow's steeper slope. Same pattern, same pitch. But the distance was different. On the previous shifts, she had estimated the source at 300 to 400 meters up the slope. This time, it was closer. She estimated 200 meters, maybe less. The hollow's wall was not that wide. Whatever was producing the sound had moved down the slope, toward the road, in the direction of the junction where she was parked. She did not shine the flashlight, she did not call out. She checked the door locks, both doors, both correct, and kept her eyes on the slope above the tree line where it was visible against the sky. Nothing moved. The whistle did not repeat. She noted the closer distance in her field book and did not allow herself to speculate about what it meant on paper. She knew what it meant. She had known since Ruth's porch at midnight what the pattern of it meant, and knowing and writing it were different things. At 1:15, the headlights earned their keep. She had kept them on through the shift, not standard practice. It drained the battery if the engine wasn't running, and she'd kept the engine running precisely for this reason. The headlights reached about 80 meters forward on the access road before the first curve absorbed them. She was watching the road at 1:15 because it was something to watch, a direction that was not the invisible slope above her when she saw the figure. It was at the limit of the headlight reach, 80 meters forward, at the edge of where the light thinned and the road began to curve away. Upright. Still. Approximately the height and shape of a person. She did not drive toward it. She sat with her hands on the wheel and looked at it for a long time, trying to establish detail at that distance and in that light. It was simply there. A vertical shape at the road's edge, not moving, not approaching. She called out the standard ranger challenge through the cracked window. She didn't open it. She cracked it 2 inches and called through the gap. Identified herself, stated the road was closed, requested identification. The shape did not respond. It did not move. She watched it for 90 seconds, counting in her head the way she had started counting things, giving herself numbers to hold on to. Then the cloud cover shifted and the ambient light changed for a moment, and she looked at the shape, and something about its orientation was wrong. It appeared to be standing sideways, body facing the hollow wall, not the road, but the head appeared to be turned toward her, facing her direction, watching her from a body that was facing somewhere else. She locked both doors again, which she had already locked, the redundancy not lost on her. At 1:58, the shape was gone. She had not looked away for more than a few seconds at any point during those 43 minutes. The shape had been there, and then it was not there, and she had not seen it move or diminish or step back into the trees. One moment it occupied space at the road's edge, and the next moment that space was empty, and the headlights were showing her 80 meters of empty road curving away into the dark. The radio check at 2 came 4 minutes early. Ray calling in at 1:56, his voice breaking through the static with the particular relief of a sound that belongs to the ordinary world. She told him conditions were stable, and she'd call again at 3. 40 seconds of static, broken conversation, his voice steady and familiar, and she felt the specific comfort of being heard by another person who knew where she was. She held on to that comfort and kept the engine running and logged the figure sighting in her field book. Approximately 0115, unknown subject, Catawba Hollow Access Road, estimated 80 meters, declined to respond to challenge, departed without observed movement, orientation inconsistent, and checked her H when she wrote Hollow and Holt, and it was straight and correct and hers. At 2:38, she heard her own voice. It came from below the ridgeline, uphill from the road, northwest bearing, consistent with where the whistle had been coming from all 8 shifts. She estimated 200 meters, maybe a little less. Close enough that the hollow walls couldn't account for significant distortion. Close enough that she could hear the inflection clearly. Her voice said, "Dana." A pause. She sat completely still with her hands on the wheel. The engine ran. The heater fan moved air through the cab. Outside, the hollow was silent in the way it got silent when something was using the available sound for something else. Then her voice said, "Dana, come up." She knew her own voice. She had heard it on recordings enough times to know the way it sounded to other people. The slight upward lilt at the end of her name when she was uncertain. The quality of it when she was asking rather than stating. The voice from the ridge had all of it. The lilt, the asking quality. The way she sounded when she was not entirely sure of something but was trying not to show it. Her mouth was closed. Her radio was in her right hand. She had not spoken, she did not answer. That was the first decision, made before she fully understood she was making it. Silence, locked doors, engine running, hands on the wheel. Ruth's words were in her head without her choosing to put them there. If it sounds like you, that's the worst one. Just drive out. She picked up the field book to note the time before she moved. The 2:38 entry was already written. She had not written it. She had been sitting with her hands on the wheel since 2:30, watching the road, and she had not touched the field book. The entry at 2:38 was in the wrong H hollow with the curved left leg, Hollis with the curved left leg. 2 occurrences, the same small tell. The entry read, "She is going to answer." Future tense. Written at 2:38. She had heard her own voice at 2:40. She put the truck in reverse. She did not stop to process what she was holding. The field book, the 2-minute gap, the tense of the sentence, the thing it meant about how much had been observed, and for how long, and with what quality of attention. She processed it moving. She reversed down the Catawba Hollow access road in the dark, with the headlights pointing back at the ridge she was leaving, and her voice still available to her memory, asking her to come up, and she drove until she reached the county lane and then drove further, past Ruth's dark house, out to the main road where the county lane met the state route, and the cell service came back strong, and the lights of a passing truck were the most reassuring thing she had seen in 8 shifts. She called Ray. She told him she was out and would explain in the morning. He said he'd see her then. She drove home. The voice had not called a 3rd time. She did not know if that meant it had stopped or if it meant she had driven out of range before it could. She suspected, and still suspects, that it had not stopped, that it had simply waited. Dawn came gray and ordinary over the county lane. The kind of morning that makes everything from the night before feel like it happened in a different register of reality. Possible, technically, but difficult to hold in full daylight. Dana sat in her truck at the main road junction until 6, when Ray called and said he was heading to the district office and asked if she wanted to meet there first. She said yes. She drove with the heat on and the radio off. She did not turn the radio on at any point during the drive. At the office, she showed Ray the field book. She opened it to the 238 entry and set it on the desk between them without explaining it first, letting him read it before she said anything. He read it. He read it again. He looked at the 240 entry below it, resumed patrol, all clear, in her handwriting, her H, her pen pressure. Then he looked at the 238 entry again, the wrong H, twice, in an entry she had not written, in future tense, about something that had happened 2 minutes after it was written. Ray said, "How long has this been going on?" She told him. All of it, the first blank period on shift 3, the wrong H entry, Ruth and her father, the second blank period on shift 7. She is still here, the figure on the road at 1:15, the voice at 2:40. She told it in order and without embellishment. And when she finished, Ray sat with it for a moment and then said he was going back up there with her. She said she wasn't going back up the road. He said he understood that. He said they would go to the gate junction, document what needed documenting, close out the shift log properly, and come back. He said he would drive. They reached the gate junction at 9 in the morning. Ray drove his own truck. The sky had lightened to a pale, flat gray. No fog. The creek audible, but calm. The hollow in daylight was narrow and dark, with heavy timber on both walls, but it was not threatening in the way it was at night. It was simply a hollow. North-facing, cold, the kind of terrain that looked like what it was. A crease in the mountain where water ran and light arrived late. Ray stopped the truck at the junction and they got out. Dana looked at the access road ahead of the gate. The mud from the previous night's ground fog and light dew had softened the road surface in the low areas, the way hollow roads do when the temperature drops overnight and the moisture settles. She looked at the road surface and felt the specific anticipatory quality of not wanting to see what she was about to see. The boot prints were there. Adult, standard hiking boot tread, pressed into the mud of the access road in a single line going forward, toward the hollow, toward the ridge, up the road. One set. No return prints. They began at the gate, where the chain was padlocked and intact, and continued up the center of the road until they rounded the first curve approximately 60 meters in and disappeared from view. No prints on the outside of the gate. No prints approaching the gate from the county lane side. The prints simply began at the gate's inner edge, as if whoever made them had started walking from that exact point without arriving. Ray photographed them without speaking. He documented the tread pattern, the depth, the spacing, normal walking stride, no irregularity, no drag. He photographed the gate, the padlock, the absence of prints on the approach side. Then he said, "Could be someone went out a back way." Dana didn't answer that. Ray lowered the camera. He looked at the prints for a moment longer. Then he held out his hand for the field book. She gave it to him. He read the 3 wrong H entries in sequence. The shift 3 entry she hadn't flagged. The shift 7 entry reading, "She is still here." The shift 13 entry reading, "She is going to answer." He read them slowly, the way a careful person reads something they want to understand before they respond to it. When he finished, he put the field book in the chest pocket of his vest and buttoned it. She asked if she was getting it back. He said he would handle the documentation. He said it in the tone of a supervisor managing a situation that required a certain kind of handling. Not dismissive, not disbelieving. Careful in the way that careful people are careful when they have decided that something needs to be contained rather than explained. The official notation Ray submitted to the district records office described the logbook anomalies as evidence of possible trespass and interference by an unknown party. The boot prints as consistent with unauthorized access via unknown ingress route, and recommended installation of a trail camera at the gate junction to monitor the access road during the remainder of the closure period. All three notations were accurate as far as they went. None of them addressed the tense of the 2:38 entry or the 2-minute interval between it and the event it described. Dana requested the trail camera herself. It was installed 4 days later, facing the gate, covering the first 30 meters of the access road. She was no longer assigned to Catawba Hollow by then. She had submitted the transfer request the morning after she and Ray went back. 2 sentences: district transfer requested, non-night patrol assignment preferred. It was approved within the week. No explanation was required and none was given. The camera ran for the remainder of the closure period and for 6 weeks after the road reopened. During that time, it recorded no figure at the gate, no boot prints on the access road, no unauthorized entry. The closure ended. The road was repaired and reopened, and hikers signed the trailhead register at the hollow's lower end and walked in and came back out and signed out again. On 3 separate occasions during the 6 weeks of post-closure monitoring, at 2:38 in the morning, the camera recorded a static burst. Not a malfunction. The camera's internal log showed it functioning correctly before and after each event. Just static at 2:38, lasting between 4 and 7 seconds, on 3 separate nights that were otherwise uneventful. The erosion repair held. The road is open. People hike Catawba Hollow on weekends. Ray retired 2 years after the transfer. He kept the field book, as far as Dana knows. She has not asked for it back. She is not certain she wants it. She still works the service. Different district, day shifts primarily, the kind of work that puts her on the road by 7 in the morning and has her back at the office before the light goes. She is good at the job. Her supervisor says so and means it. She keeps her field notebook the same way she always has. Dated entries, timed, careful handwriting, every capital letter formed consistently. She checks the H every entry, every day. She is aware that this is something she will probably do for the rest of her career and possibly longer. She does it the way Marcus Holt marks positions before he moves, and the way Sylvia Cates doesn't stop at the Cold Branch trailhead, and the way Dale Combs checked the Laurel Branch gate twice before he drove away. A small, precise habit built on top of a thing that couldn't be filed or discarded or explained in language that official records would accept. She no longer puts her thermos on the hood when she parks at gate junctions. She keeps it inside the truck. She doesn't stand outside in the dark when she doesn't have to. She is not certain she can explain the connection between the thermos and what happened on Catawba Hollow Road, but the connection is there somewhere, the way all the small details of those shifts are still there. The creak noise masking footsteps, the flashlight reaching 60 meters and stopping, the wrong H appearing in entries she had no memory of writing, a voice with her exact inflection asking her to come up. The day she and Ray went back to the gate junction, before they drove out, Ray stood at the chain and looked up the access road for a long time. Long enough that Dana watched him instead of the road. His expression was the specific expression of a person doing a calculation that isn't coming out right. She asked what he was thinking. He said, "I've worked this district for 22 years. I've never walked up that road past the first curve." She asked why not. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Couldn't tell you, just never did." He drove them out. The hollow road was exactly as long as it had always been. The county lane was at the end of it. Ruth's house was dark as they passed. The morning they went back, there had been one boot print at the base of the gate post. In the soft mud at the road's edge, pressed in while they were standing 6 feet away, while Ray was photographing the line of prints and Dana was watching him. One boot print appeared at the post's base without a sound. Fresh mud, no approach. Facing uphill. Neither of them heard anything. Ray looked at it for a long time. Then he locked the gate log and walked back to the truck. Dana followed. Neither of them said anything. The hollow was behind the gate and the morning was ordinary in every direction except that one, and there didn't seem to be anything left to say.